Welcome to Climate Change and Moral Psychology. I've got some new stuff for this studio. We've got the new poster. We've got two friends there up in the back. So, I don't need to tell you that climate change is one of the most important issues in modern politics. With the potential to wipe out the entire planet, it's concerning to see so many people who won't support efforts to mitigate it. But what does the realm of moral psychology suggest for the reluctance of many to support measures to stop climate change? Can it give us any tools to convince people otherwise? And what problems might we face on the way? So, let's answer the question. What can moral psychology suggest about the likelihood of democratically mitigating climate change? But before we do that, as you can see right here on the screen now in front of the brand new poster, very few of you are actually subscribed. If you're liking what you're watching, you want to see more of my stuff, and you just want to give me a little bit of a boost, at the point of recording this, we only have 499, so quite close to 500 and halfway to the 1,000, the big one, several O's that we're trying to get to. So, yeah. Let's do this. So first of all, let's just establish the numerous unique problems to do with moving people to act on climate change. So as seen in Markowitz et al. 2012, these problems include things such as the abstract and complex nature of the problem. So, climate change is extremely complicated and all-encompassing. People will tend to basically not care about something they can't understand. We also have the blamelessness of unintentional action. So it's tough to know who to blame on climate change, really. There isn't like a single villain, there's not a Dr. Doom style villain on a volcano somewhere pressing all the buttons to kill the climate, which means that it's hard to rally behind something. There's also the issue of a guilty bias, so people don't like being accused of a problem. They feel like they're to blame. They're more likely to downplay the issue. So if you say to someone, your littering is going to kill the planet, people don't like being accused of a very real problem, so they're going to naturally sort of step away from that. Because if they were to, accept how bad the situation is, they're going to have to accept some sort of blame. Next up, we have, the idea of uncertainty breeding wishful thinking. You'll see this a lot if you watch sort of any content by anti-climate change or climate change skeptics. They will sort of cast doubt on the scientific consensus, but the doubt is never, is it real or not? The doubt is it 100 years or 20 years? And through this casting doubt, people will naturally err on the side of what is better for them. People will believe what they want to believe if there is just even that shroud of doubt. So unless there's a very clear answer, people are going to go, well, I'm sure it's going to be fine, which maybe not. Another big one is moral tribalism, as we all see, very common now in modern politics. The idea of long-term horizons in faraway places. This being, the idea that the problem of climate change affecting people is quite a way down the line, so people will basically try and ignore it. Other studies would suggest that conservatives would tend to believe more. There tends to be less of a care for future generations and more of a care for the immediate consequences of something. So that's why you'll often hear the argument, oh, it's too expensive or it's bad for the economy. I don't know, that their moral framework tends to rely more on sort of the immediate impacts of something. Obviously here, before we try and actually get into solving the problem, we need to realize who we're trying to convince. The people who need convincing, unsurprisingly on a whole, are the conservatives, who in the US are far more likely to oppose further climate change policies or, for example, like a Green New Deal. In fact, when asked if there is need for more government efforts to reduce the effects of climate change, only about 1/4 of conservative Republicans, that's 24%, say yes, while about half, 48%, think the government is doing about the right amount currently, and another 26% says it's doing, in fact, too much. So, first of all, to think that the American government is doing enough right now is pretty ridiculous. To think they're doing too much, that's a whole different ballgame. So, we have established some of the unique challenges to convincing people to support for and vote for policies to mitigate climate change. But are there any ways we can overcome this reluctance that we see amongst so many people? Well, there just might be. A study done in 2013 by Feinberg et al. Et al. Just means more people. It took me a long time to learn that. When placing environmental issues in a more conservative moral framework, there was seen to be more support by conservatives for policies to mitigate climate change. So what is this moral framework that we talk about? So in Feinberg, basically the study's methodology was they had different groups of people across the political spectrum, they had them self-identify, and they asked questions in different sort of moral framings. This could be a neutral framing, which was just, do you think this is good or bad? Something like that. Or it could be something which is more of a left-wing framing, or you would have the right-wing framing. And the right-wing framing was specifically with the concepts of purity and sanctity, these being sort of a moral motivation which is more favourable to a conservative-leaning person. Questions that managed to convince the conservatives the most were ones on ideas of clean streets, pure air quality, sort of a cleaner and safer community. And these sorts of framings of questions meant that conservatives were considerably more likely to show pro-environmental attitudes. Putting it in terms which would more fit a sort of purity, sanctity, or cleanliness way was very successful in convincing more conservatives to support climate change policies. And this would suggest that if environmental issues were portrayed in a manner which involved purity and sanctity, those who are typically likely to oppose climate change issues, the conservatives, would be more likely to be convinced. Whilst obviously this won't be pulling over, your Donald Trumps anytime soon, the framing was seen to be effective for many deeply tribal and partisan conservatives. This could mean that democratically mitigating climate change is actually very feasible. It seems like we have a good chance of convincing people on the opposite side of an aisle to support climate change issues, just by using the concept of framing when going out and trying to sell these ideas. So basically, what could be successful would be placing the ideas of purity and sanctity at the center of selling climate change policies. A likely question following this conclusion, however, is that surely if conservative moral foundations are put at the center of climate change issues, then liberals will be less likely to support it. So if we frame all climate change issues in a language which is more appealing to conservatives, left-wing people and liberal people will be more likely to get turned off by it because it's not in their moral framework. However, if you read on in Feinberg et al. 2013, under the purity example, liberals showed very little difference in their environmental attitudes, holding on to their support for climate change reduction. So it seemed like no matter how you frame an issue, liberals and left-wing people are already pretty much sold on efforts to mitigate climate change. So it seems like all we need to do to convince people to actually vote for climate change issues is simple. Frame it in purity and sanctity, the liberals won't be turned off by it, the conservatives will be convinced. Boom, you've heard it here first. Dutiful Future has solved climate change, we've done it. Let's have a massive party. Woohoo, hell yeah, let's go. But it is important to recognize that a commonly held issue in moral psychology is the existence of what's called an attitude-behavior gap, meaning that there can be a disconnect between the attitudes and beliefs one may espouse and the actions they will actually take. This would suggest that results found in Feinberg, which show attitudinal differences, may not transfer into actual behavior, i.e., voting for environmental issues, or even something as simple as recycling. And specifically related to climate change issues, there is actually some evidence to support this being a problem. This can be seen in Valkila et al. In 2013, which found an attitude-behavior gap between people's attitudes towards climate change and their energy consumption / their carbon footprint. And this study suggested that those who even strongly wanted to mitigate climate change may not actually make choices which would go in line with this. This challenges the Feinberg conclusion, as whilst framing did change attitudes, the paper presented no actual evidence of changing behaviour. And as shown in Valkila, there is often a prominent disconnect between the two, which would unfortunately limit the feasibility of convincing people to support efforts to combat climate change. On the other hand, however, there is evidence of framing overcoming this attitude-behavior gap. Whilst it seemed to be rather difficult, in study 2 of the Kidwell et al. 2013 study, I don't know whether they're from 2013, they found that framing of the issue of recycling not only led to an increased intention to recycle, so a change in the attitude towards recycling, but also increased the physical amount they actually recycle. So when convincing people that they should recycle, people showed that they wanted to recycle more, and then they did actually recycle more, which sounds crazy. In the field of moral psychology, this is actually quite impressive. It's difficult to push people beyond what they're going to say to what they'll do, therefore increasing the potential for democratically combating climate change, as it's possible to overcome this attitude-behavior gap that we saw earlier in Valkila through the means of framing, potentially through an increased role of what's called fluency in presenting said moral framework. So fluency just means how well can you simplify and sell your ideas. And as we saw earlier with a lot of the unique problems that we have in climate change, one can conceive could be solved with framing. Guilty bias? Easy. Don't blame individuals, blame the 100 companies that are responsible for a super high percentage of climate emissions, maybe 70%, I'll have to put it up right here now. One can see how framing, whilst it may be difficult, can push past the sort of reluctance to support these issues, even when it's not even down to any sort of substantive difference, it's just moral tribalism. Overall, call me an optimist, but I would argue that democratically combating climate change is in fact feasible, if difficult. Through the use of purity and sanctity as a framing device, I believe that we can see some real success in convincing people who are currently opposed to further measures to stop climate change into changing their minds, which would be amazing. In practical senses, this would require sort of a widespread effort. It's going to be hard to sort of pick who is going to be selling the issue in this way. So who are the main climate change sellers? I imagine it would be difficult to sell to someone who, I don't know, runs a climate change advocacy group to say, oh no, stop talking about how people are going to die. Talk about purity and sanctity. That's difficult to do. However, I think the evidence does show that it would be an effective strategy. And of course, while there is the issue of the attitude behavior gap would potentially prevent influence from framing manifesting into democratic results, we do see evidence with Kidwell, for example, that this can be overcome. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this quick academic dive into the world of fighting climate change with moral psychology. If you have any questions, just ask them in the comments. I will be citing my little bibliography in the description of this video if you want to read the studies yourself. I would recommend it. Some of them aren't awfully dense reads. Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed. This has been Climate Change and Moral Psychology. Thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed it, please subscribe. Thank you.